Good afternoon, grade 10. Our lesson for today is about the menstrual cycle. And this is teacher Mildred, and this is biology grade 10. Before we start, let us first recall what we have discussed last time about the period of ovulation. Usually, one egg is released into the oviduct every month in an adult woman. Before the egg cell is released, the lining of the uterus becomes thick and spongy to prepare itself for a fertilized egg cell. It is full of tiny blood vessels ready to supply the embryo with food and oxygen if it should survive. If the egg cell is not fertilized, it is dead by the time that it reaches the uterus. It does not sink into the spongy wall, but continues onwards down through the vagina. As the spongy lining is not needed now, it gradually disintegrates. It too is slowly lost through the vagina, and this is called menstruation or a period. It usually lasts for 5 days. After menstruation, the lining of the uterus builds up again so that it will be ready to receive the next egg if it is fertilized. So, what really happens during the menstrual cycle? On the first day of the cycle, menstruation begins, which means that the thick lining of the uterus breaks down and is lost through the vagina, since it is not needed because the egg cell was not fertilized. 1 week into the cycle, the uterus lining is just starting to build up again, and an egg is ripening in the ovary. Follicles, each containing an egg, begin to develop in one of the ovaries. 2 weeks into the cycle, an egg is released from the ovary. We call this the ovulation period. The lining of the uterus is soft and thick and ready to receive the egg if it is fertilized. And 3 weeks into the cycle, the egg has almost reached the uterus. If it hasn't been fertilized, it will die, and the cycle will begin again. There are four important phases during the menstrual cycle. Phase 1 is menstruation. The thickened uterine lining falls away so the body can start preparing a new one. The second phase is follicular, which means that the hormones prompt the creation of follicles on the ovaries. Usually, just one follicle will mature into an egg. The third phase is the ovulation, in which the mature egg is released from the follicle and is ready for fertilization. And finally, phase 4 is luteal, which means that if there is no fertilized egg, your body will prepare to shed its thickened lining, and the cycle will begin again with menstruation. Menstruation is one of the many changes that happens in a girl upon approaching puberty. But what is the difference between puberty and adolescence? The time when a person approaches sexual maturity is called adolescence. In this period, sperm production begins in a boy and ovulation in a girl. When sexual maturity is reached, it is now called puberty. This is often several years earlier for girls than for boys. At puberty, a person is still not completely adult because emotional development is not complete. What are the physical changes or the secondary sexual characteristics that develops in a boy and in a girl upon approaching puberty or during adolescence. In boys, these include growth of facial and pubic hair, breaking of the voice, and muscular development. And in girls, pubic hair begins to grow, the breasts develop, and the pelvic girdle becomes broader. These changes are brought about by hormones. The hormone for male is testosterone, and the female hormone is estrogen, which is produced in the ovaries. Do you know that the menstrual cycle is being controlled by important hormones? There are four important hormones that control the menstrual cycle. Estrogen is not the only female sex hormone. The ovaries also produce a hormone called progesterone during certain stages of the menstrual cycle and during pregnancy. The secretion of these hormones is controlled by two other hormones secreted by the pituitary gland in the head. These hormones are the LH and FSH. Let us now study in detail the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle. Whereas male mammals make sperm all the time, females only produce eggs at certain times. We have seen that in humans, ovulation happens once a month. Ovulation is part of the menstrual cycle. First, a follicle develops inside an ovary. The development of the follicle is stimulated by FSH. The developing follicle secretes estrogen, and the concentration of estrogen in the blood steadily increases. The estrogen makes the lining of the uterus thick and spongy to prepare the fertilized egg. Throughout this time, the pituitary gland secretes LH and FSH. These two hormones stimulate the follicle to keep on secreting estrogen. When the follicle is fully developed, there is a surge in the production of LH, causing ovulation to take place. As you can see in the graph, there is a high concentration of LH during the ovulation period or the fertility period, in which the ovary is ready to release an egg cell. The follicular phase happens during the first and 13th day of the menstrual cycle, and the luteal phase happens during the 14th to the 28th day of the menstrual cycle. So what happens after the period of ovulation? The now empty follicle stops secreting estrogen. It becomes corpus luteum. The corpus luteum starts to secrete another hormone, which is the progesterone, and the levels of FSH and LH fall. Progesterone keeps the uterus lining thick, spongy, and well supplied with blood in case the egg is fertilized. If it is not fertilized, then the corpus luteum gradually disappears. Progesterone is not secreted anymore, and so the lining of the uterus breaks down. Menstruation happens. A new follicle starts to develop in the ovary, and the cycle begins again. Let us now go back to the previous diagram that I gave about the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is divided into four important phases, namely the follicular phase, the ovulation phase, the luteal phase, and the menstrual phase. Let us recall or review how the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle happens. On the first phase, which is the follicular phase, a follicle develops inside an ovary. And this development of the follicle is controlled by FSH. The developing follicle secretes estrogen, and the concentration of estrogen in the blood increases. What is the importance of estrogen at this phase? The estrogen makes the lining of the uterus grow thick and spongy, and throughout this time, the pituitary gland secretes LH and FSH. These two hormones stimulate the follicle to keep on secreting estrogen. After the follicle is fully developed, it will now go to the ovulation phase, in which, during the ovulation phase, there is a surge in the production of LH. And what is the role of the LH in the ovulation phase? The LH causes ovulation to take place, or it causes the ovary to release an egg cell. After the egg cell has been released, the now empty follicle stops secreting estrogen and it becomes corpus luteum. The corpus luteum starts to secrete another hormone, which is the progesterone, and levels of FSH and LH fall. It is now in the luteal phase. Progesterone keeps the uterus lining thick and spongy and well supplied with blood in case that the egg is fertilized. If the egg is not fertilized, then the corpus luteum gradually disappears and progesterone is not secreted anymore, so the lining of the uterus breaks down and menstruation happens. And that is now the menstrual phase. A new follicle starts to develop in the ovary and the cycle begins again. But what will happen to the hormones in case that the egg is fertilized? If the egg is fertilized, the corpus luteum does not degenerate so quickly. It carries on secreting progesterone until the embryo sinks into the uterus wall and a placenta develops. Then, the placenta secretes progesterone and carries on secreting it all through the pregnancy. The progesterone maintains the uterus lining so that menstruation does not happen during pregnancy, meaning for 9 months, a pregnant woman would not experience menstruation since the progesterone maintains the uterus lining. And that's the end of the lesson about menstrual cycle. I hope that you have learned something new today.